Welcome back to Presidents and Politics. I am one of your hosts, Professor Caleb McGee, joined by my fellow co-host, former Congressman Ross. We made it.
Here he is.
Teddy Roosevelt, 26th president, and arguably one of the best.
Yes, and this podcast will not do it justice.
Definitely the manliest, right?
Oh, my.
Definitely the manliest. And probably one of the coolest presidents has ever been. I think you and I, when we first started talking about this project of Presidents and Politics, we were making the jokes that, can we just make it to Teddy Roosevelt? We made it.
We made it to Teddy Roosevelt.
And I feel like it's one of those things that we're here, and I want to stay here for a while. We can only, give 1 week to it, but...
Yeah. I mean, just the legend is reality.
Yes,
that's
which is
the thing
rare,
about him.
Right?
Yes, I mean that's the thing. This guy did the most amazing things, even before, and it's even Providence. I think how he even became president, the youngest president at the time, born into wealth,
extreme wealth.
Yes, but born with ailments, asthma, as poor eyesight. And I think he used his wealth to say, there's more to life than this.
That's right.
And because he studied at Harvard and then went to law school at Columbia, and then after a year left and got elected to the legislature at age 23 in New York.
Yes.
I mean, this guy's ambitious as can be.
Oh, they talked about, if you read his biographers, I've read so much about Teddy Roosevelt. Going into this, we said this isn't really a research podcast. This is an editing podcast.
Yes.
Because I think back over my just years of study, it's like, how much can we just condense of this guy's life? But all his biographers agree that he had a motor that would not stop. He went 24/7 all the time.
Yeah.
And what he accomplished he died at 60, right?
I know.
He died at 60, and yet he accomplished more than most people could accomplish in 100 years.
Oh, gosh, yes.
One of the greatest minds and just wills. And let's just start with a story, because there's just so many stories about him. And you and I talk this story a lot, and that's his assassination attempt.
Yeah.
So when he runs, it would technically kind of be a third term, but it wasn't a third term because he was technically the vice president who came in for the nonetheless. Correct. As he's running for the Bull Moose Party, he is given this speech and he steps up on stage and there's an assassination attempt. The guy tries to shoot him from the crowd. In his inside jacket pocket, he has a metal glasses case and a bunch of notes all folded up. So that slows the bullet down a tremendous amount, and it lands in his chest. He's a big barrel-chested guy, over 200 pounds. So what he does in the middle of the speech is he stops, notices that he's shot, takes his finger, puts it in the hole, and coughs because he's a hunter. And he knows that blood will splurt out if it's hit the lung. He coughs a few times. He goes, okay, my lung's not hit. Puts his jacket back over and finishes the speech. Speaks for another, 45 minutes with a bullet in his chest. All right? And I love the fact that he's this idea of toughness, like tempered with justice.
Yes. Because
the crowd wants to beat the guy to death. And he says, no, back off, let the guy alone, hand him over to custody, don't hurt him.
He was a man of law and rules, no question about it. And again, the anomaly is he was a frail and sickly boy.
Yes,
and he was determined, and I think that's what he loved about other people, the individual achievement, because his individual achievement was so amazing that I think he admired those who aspired to it as well.
What do Americans love more than anything else? An underdog story.
Oh.
And in many ways, he is an underdog story, not necessarily with wealth, but with physique. Now, you talk about this, I always do this in my class. Medical science at the time was challenging, right?
Correct.
And actually, what the doctors prescribed for young child Teddy Roosevelt, I'm talking like the age of 3 and 4, because his asthma was so bad, was strong black coffee and cigars. Because they believed that strong cigars would help him cough up the mucus and stuff. So I always tell my class, can you imagine 3-year-old Teddy Roosevelt, like he's smoking stogies and drinking black coffee? Maybe that explains
his
why he turned out like he did. But he had a unique childhood in the sense that his mother was not very nurturing, but his father was very compassionate. So he talked about that, growing up, his father would be the one who'd walk him down the hall in the middle of the night when he was choking on asthma, patting him on the back and helping him. And then later it's his dad who would pull him aside and basically be like, son, you've got this brilliant mind, but your body is failing. Strengthen your body.
And he does.
He does.
He is. And he's not without catastrophes in his life. The same year his mom and his wife die.
That's right.
And he leaves him with a young girl. And
he kind of has a crisis of life, if you will, because he leaves all of New York and the money, he leaves it all behind.
He goes to the Badlands.
Becomes a cattle
rancher and a sheriff.
Yes.
and spends several years out there. And I think that to him probably did more to form who he was. Because, I talk about this with my students, and the most important thing is to be confident with who you are.
That's right.
And you imagine, here's a guy who was born into wealth in a New York family, loses his wife, loses his mother, and moves to the Badlands, which is just absolutely primitive living.
Absolutely. And anarchy in some ways.
Yes. And goes out there for several years and not only survives but thrives. And I think that builds him and gives him the confidence that he can do just about anything if he puts his mind to it.
I love that you brought that up, this idea of confidence, because this is one thing that I don't think we instill in our students at all. Not here at Southeastern. I'm saying as an American institution, we don't instill confidence in individuals.
Yeah.
And that's probably especially true of young men. We don't instill confidence in men. And this is one thing that I look at with the life of Teddy Roosevelt. And you talk about this. He had self-sacrifice, voluntary hardships.
Yes.
And because of these voluntary hardships, he had proven himself to himself.
Exactly. And there was no challenge that he wouldn't undertake. In fact, I think he lived for challenges.
I do too.
He resigns as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to create the Rough Riders.
Yes.
And lead the charge in Cuba up San Juan Hill. I mean, this guy's amazing. He had a cushy life. He could have just been, but no.
He could have been in the clubs of New York, smoking cigars, taking it easy, going to the opera.
Yeah.
But instead...
Yeah, but the thing is also politically, when he was appointed, the police commissioner, he rooted out injustice and corruption.
He did,
and it was upsetting the political bosses.
Yes.
You can't do this, but he was doing.
Yes.
He did it because he believed in the rule of law and the right thing.
And I love you talk. He said that he would enforce laws, even laws he didn't believe in.
Yeah.
For example, there was it was like early Prohibition days that you weren't allowed to sell alcohol on Sundays, you weren't allowed to drink on certain days, all this kind of stuff. And he said he totally disagreed with it. Right? I mean, he's lived out west. He believes in drink whenever you want to. But when he was a police commissioner, he was busting cops on the job who were doing it anyway. Yeah. He was doing everything he could. And when he asked him, he's like, "No, I totally disagree with the law, but it's the law, and we're going to enforce it."
Yeah.
I mean, that was.
And today we've got prosecutorial discretion. We're not going to enforce the law because I just don't think it's right, or by golly, that's so fundamental to our system of justice and our system of laws that we've got to be able to have people that enforce those existing laws. And if you don't like it, then we work through the process and change it.
Change the law, exactly. Yeah. If it's that bad of a law, it shouldn't be in the books.
Well, take it, for example, when he was president and he finally starts busting up the trusts.
Yes.
And he uses the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been ineffective, and he's successful with it.
Yes.
I mean, here's a guy that I think was amazing in that he believed, as a Republican, he believed in capitalism, free enterprise, but he also believed the importance, necessity, and significance of labor, and he became the great mediator between it.
He still is.
He still is.
I always have this in classes, and I love this because one of the reasons why I teach so much on Teddy Roosevelt is because he's a uniter. I can walk into a survey class that has 80 students, like 80 freshmen, and I'll start talking about Teddy Roosevelt, and everyone smiles. And it can be complete left liberals and complete far right conservatives, and they all love Teddy Roosevelt because in many ways he had the best of both worlds. He's pro-environment, he's pro-union, he's pro-worker, but he's also pro-police and pro-military and pro-America. I mean, he had pro-business. He had this unique ability to unite people across the aisle.
And isn't that one of the most fundamental characteristics of a good leader?
Yes.
Is being able to unite, not divide. And today we live in a world where division just seems to be the way of life, and it's not healthy. We need more Teddy Roosevelts. We need more leaders that unite. And those, again, are the ones that are confident with who they are. They don't need to character assassinate somebody to gain an upper hand.
I'm reminded again, because it's just my pastor's mind at times, I'm reminded again of the Old Testament, the first king, King Saul, right? King Saul, the Bible says of King Saul, he was head and shoulders, but like physically he's got it all, right? And he's wealthy, he's from a good family, but he always was insecure about himself. And if you remember Samuel the prophet, one time talking to Saul, said, "Your problem is you're always small in your own eyes."
Wow.
And I thought, you just think about that. And I think about people that I've known throughout my life or leaders that we study, historical figures. And typically the guys that had no confidence, that were constantly making mistakes, they were small in their own eyes.
True.
And here's Teddy Roosevelt. And like you said, if anyone had an excuse to make, it was Teddy Roosevelt. But he never did make that excuse. And he was confident in who he was.
Yes.
And because he was confident in who he was, he could accomplish these great things. We need to produce individuals who are confident in who they are so they can go out and do great things. They don't have to constantly prove themselves.
Absolutely.
Speaking of that, there's a quote that he makes in his biography, which he writes over 40 books in his life. I mean, prolific author. But as in his autobiography, he talks about when he takes over the presidency, because he's the vice president, of course, McKinley.
Right.
And when he takes over the presidency, he said that the common idea of the time, of the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, was that you would fire all of the cabinet and you would restart over. He didn't do that. And he said he was going to keep the cabinet because if they were adequate, competent men, they worked to their job, not to their boss, which is brilliant thought process.
Yeah, there's just a novel idea.
It's a brilliant thought process. And then his in the Republican Party, they said, well, you're going to be known as a pale McKinley. That's all you know. You got to change all his policies. And he said, his policies are good. I'm going to keep doing them. It doesn't matter who wrote them. And then he said this, and I love this. He said, and as for being a pale copy of McKinley, I was not primarily concerned with either following or not following in his footsteps, but in facing the new problems that arose, and that if I were competent, I would find ample opportunity to show my competence by my deeds without worrying myself as to how to convince people of the fact that I was competent.
Wow. The proof is in the pudding. Yeah.
I love this. Here's Roosevelt, and he's just like, listen, I was going to do the right thing, no matter what the right thing was. It doesn't matter who gets the credit. It doesn't matter who came up with the idea. If it's a good idea, we're going to do it.
Yep. And you know what's amazing, though, too, is that he is so good at doing that they don't like him in New York, so they convinced McKinley to put him on the ticket for his vice president.
Yes, because he's the governor of New York.
Yes.
He has too much power as the governor of New York. They're like, so they used to call, who was it? One of the old Republican bosses called the vice president the graveyard where political careers die.
Yes.
And I can't remember who said that first. But they thought they could just pretty much silence him, right?
And put him over there.
And he comes in, and I'm trying to remember what this is. He comes in it's like March to September is all that he is the VP, basically.
Yeah.
And then he's president.
Yeah.
He's out camping with his family.
Yeah.
And he's carried, I think before he's officially sworn in, they tell him he's president, but he's officially sworn in. He's taken to a house in like Buffalo, New York, and he's sworn in. And now he's the youngest president.
42.
42 years old.
Yeah.
So this is obviously before Kennedy, who I guess was the next youngest president to ever serve in this office.
Amazing. And what a time! The Industrial Revolution. I mean, there was so much going on. You know, he had a very good foreign policy. This speak softly and carry a big stick.
Which I love that policy. I mean,
yeah. And he built the Navy. He believed in a strong Navy.
He loved the Navy.
Yeah.
In fact, the very first book that he writes is when he's in Harvard. He writes a book on the naval wars of 1812.
Wow.
Loved naval history so much that he said that the only job he would have been happy doing besides being president was to be a historical professor who specialized in naval history. He always said he wanted to retire and be a professor who taught naval history.
Good for him.
That'd be kind of cool. I'd love to sit like in a class of Teddy Roosevelt. Can you imagine his?
No, you'd just be in awe.
Yeah, I agree. But he had this mind that wouldn't stop too, right? So, like you said, he strengthens the Navy because he understands that, and I would agree with this as a historian, as a professor, I would agree with this, that the strongest part of a nation's defense is its Navy.
Yes.
And I think we lose that. Sometimes we think that's an old, like, 1700s, old school, like, commander of the sea type.
Look at what China's doing right now. They're building up the South China Sea. They're building ports in Africa. They're going to be able to maintain a strong presence in the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean, all with their Navy. And we're watching it happen.
Read historically massive battles and wars, specifically wars, because battles can be won and lost. And typically the power that has the largest Navy wins. Why did England control the world for hundreds of years? They were an island because they had the greatest Navy in the world.
Yeah.
And Teddy Roosevelt understands this. That's why he's the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for a while.
Yeah.
And holds this position, great position. And then, as you said, he resigns it voluntarily.
To go fight.
To form the Rough Riders.
And he comes back as a war hero, which catapults him to be governor.
Yes.
And then, of course, sets him in motion to be vice president. And then again, he's wins the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah, the first American. He's the very first American to ever win a Nobel Peace Prize. And back then there was
he actually earned it.
Yeah.
He mediated
the Russia and Japan, basically on who can have the land territory of Korea and a few other regions. And he loves the Japanese people through this war, through this conflict. He'll actually discover there's a book that was written called Bushido, and it's the concept of the samurai. It's a really, really interesting book, and it has the different tenets of what a samurai was. He becomes so enthralled with this work and the idea of the samurai code that if you worked for Teddy Roosevelt in politics, you had to read Bushido.
Wow.
Because he comes enamored with this Eastern philosophical ideas of the samurai code, of honor, of strength, of dignity, and it fits his personality. Because one of the things about the samurai, there's a section, and I think it's the Five Rings or Bushido, it's one of the two, and it said that when you go to war, pray for your enemy's strength so that your victory is not hollow. And this kind of like typifies the life of Teddy Roosevelt. This was kind of the man that he was.
He boxed when he was in the White House, and he's boxing, I guess, a Navy captain or something who blinds him.
Yes.
blinds him. He can't see out of one
and
eye.
doesn't even tell the guy that he blinded him. He keeps that a secret. Like, I think it's years later, he sees him with the monocle. He's like, hey, what happened to your eye? Well, actually, last time we were sparring, you detached my retina. I mean, this is the kind of... So after this, he gives up boxing because he wants to have one eye left, and he takes up an early form of jiu-jitsu. This is like before the Gracie brothers and stuff.
Wow.
But he takes up an early form of jiu-jitsu and starts learning grappling and judo and jiu-jitsu. He is just one of the most interesting people...
Very fascinating.
...that you can ever study. As we're talking about the stories, one of my favorite stories, I always tell this to my class, is in the Badland days. So back when he was, leaving New York after his wife and mother died, he's young. He goes to the Dakota territories. He's working on Elkhorn Ranch, I believe was his ranch, Elkhorn Ranch.
Yeah.
And while he's out there, he's ranching, he's cattle driving, does some sheriffing. And this is one of the things that launches him into sheriffing, is that when they're out in the Badlands of South Dakota, they have a boat on those icy rivers, is how they would travel a lot of times. And three outlaws, steal his boat. Now, he's stranded without the boat. He's got two guys with him. They're both from Maine. He says they're master woodsmen. He loves hanging out with these guys. The three of them could have just gone back to the cabin. But he says in this time period, to let an injustice go would make the land more wild. So he gets his two buddies. They build a boat from trees.
Oh.
They go down the river. They find the guys, arrest the guys, and bring them back.
That's amazing.
And while they're... And I love this because... I have to read some of this to you. He's such a good-hearted man that they capture the three of them, and then he says, once we disarmed them, once we told them basically, you're not going to resist, he's like, after that, we were kind of friends until we turned them in. And here's what he says in his own writing. Finding they were well-treated and were also watched with the closest vigilance, our prisoners behaved themselves excellently. They conversed freely with me and my two men on a number of different subjects. After the first evening, no allusion was even made to the theft or anything connected to it, so that an outsider hearing the conversation would never have guessed what the reaction of each other really was. And he talks about the fact that he would always travel with books, and he had Russian tragedy. He saw the fact that he would sit around the campfire and read Tolstoy and Russian tragedy. These guys trying to educate them before they were taken to prison.
This guy was just, yeah.
Who does that? I mean, I love his personality. He's fearless. He's courageous. He's bold. But then at the same time, he's like, we're gonna do what's right. Mm-hmm. Now, we talked about the war, the Spanish-American War, so I think we need to talk about that a little bit. Let me read you this quote, and then I want your thought on this as someone who's served in Congress and served on a lot of different committees dealing with war. He said this, I think this is so good. I suppose the United States will always be unready for war, and in consequence will always be exposed to great expense and the possibility of the gravest calamity when the nation goes to war. This is no new thing. Americans learn only from catastrophes and not from experience.
Absolutely. That is so true, and we've experienced it throughout all of our history. And maybe it's the way we are designed, in that we are not proactive as a nation. We're very reactive.
We are reactive.
And so, preparing for things is not. We didn't prepare for 9/11. We didn't prepare for Pearl Harbor. We didn't prepare for a civil war. These things and then we reacted. Sometimes we overreact in our response to it. But that is so true. I mean, again, think about it. To be that proactive almost makes you live in fear.
Or at least paranoia.
Yeah, right? Or at least paranoia.
What was it? There's an old CIA agent who wrote a biography. We were reading through one of his biographies. It was interesting. I doubt the name was even real that he gave. But in the biography, he said, it's not paranoia if they're really trying to kill you.
I love it.
But you're right. I think that mindset, living like that, it does make you paranoid.
Yeah.
And paranoia and fear is a dangerous place to work from.
Well, he took on race relations. But one of the things I admire him for is he created a controversy because he invited Booker T. Washington to have dinner with him in the White House.
That's right.
The first African American to ever do that.
That's right.
And they're like, how can you do that? And again, it comes back to individual achievement. He sees what Booker T. Washington has overcome to achieve what he has done. He's president of Tuskegee. He's a brilliant scientist, educator, and he admires that. But he doesn't. He in that regard, his race is blind. I mean, there are some other controversial things about him, when he talks about the African Americans in the South. But a lot of that has to do with the environment they're in and the culture in which they're raised.
Yeah, and I love that you brought this up with Booker T. Washington. I'm really glad you brought that up because when he does this, it has such a falling out that a lot of white political leaders say to them, we're not coming to that state dinner, including even some of the Republican Party. And TR's like, cool. Yeah. Don't come.
It's your loss.
Right? We'll save money on the catering.
Yeah. Thank you.
And I love that, like you said, and I think a lot of it does root back to he was confident in who he was.
Yes.
He was just confident who he was. Like, he didn't have to constantly prove himself. We've all been around those people who always have to tell you how smart they are, how athletic they are, how strong they are, how they're the best at everything. And those people typically are the most insecure individuals in the world.
And as you pointed out in his quote, it's the deeds.
It's the deeds.
His deeds proved himself to be the most amazing man that we've ever had in the White House.
Fully agreed.
Yeah.
And I think this idea of voluntary hardship, of taking on...
Yes.
I always tell... I tell people this all the time, especially my students, when I'll have, like, especially young men, they come to me like, hey, how can I become a stronger leader? Voluntary hardship. Like, what are you doing to actively make yourself better? Do you get up early? Do you work out? Like, do you do things do you take hard jobs? Is there voluntary hardship in your life? And if there's not, how are you ever going to create that sense of resiliency?
You're right. And confidence.
And confidence. Because confidence comes from resiliency, right?
Yes, it does.
He wrote another little book. I wish I could have brought all 40 in here. I just had to really... He wrote a little book called The Strenuous Life. This is a ridiculously tiny book. And this is one of the most amazing books ever. And Roosevelt talks about this idea. It's very stoic, right? Like if you're the Stoic philosophers. He talks to this idea of taking on hardship. And he says this, and I love this. This is how he closes it. I preach to you then, my countrymen, talking about Americans, that our country calls not for the life of ease, but for the life of strenuous endeavor. The 20th century looms before us, big with the fate of many nations. If we stand idly by, if we seek merely swollen, slothful ease and ignoble peace, if we shrink from the hard contest where men must win at hazards of their life and at the risk of all they hold dear, then the bolder and stronger peoples will pass us by, and we will win for themselves the domination of the world. Let us therefore boldly face the life of strife, resolute to do our duty well and manfully.
He definitely had an insight into the future.
He did. I mean, he's
for America.
He's writing this about 14 years before World War I breaks out.
Wow.
Right? And who would have, I guess about 18 years, and who would have ever thought all that was going to happen? And he already saw that ahead of time, saying, listen, nationalism's on the horizon, and industrial revolution, there's going to be mechanized warfare, and we've got to be ready.
Yeah.
And we weren't ready.
Oh, thank God he was. You know, I mean, just an amazing... What he did in conservation, 200 million acres set aside. It was just amazing, and thank God he had that foresight.
Yes.
You know, and then, true to his word, he doesn't seek re-election after his second term.
Goes to Africa for 2 years.
Goes to Africa, and then, and he anoints William Howard Taft to be his successor.
Which we'll get into this next week.
Oh.
What a debacle that was.
Yes.
Roosevelt thought that Taft was going to be the next Roosevelt.
Yeah, and then nobody will ever be another Roosevelt.
And Taft, I'm trying to think of a nice, slothful.
He was a large man.
Is that a nice way to?
He was a large man. He was not
even
athletic.
Just like in his personality,
He wasn't athletic.
Slothful. I mean, he just didn't have the drive that Roosevelt had.
And so Roosevelt decides to come back and says, I can't get this out of my system. I got to, and he creates the Bull Moose Party.
The Bull Moose. I wish we still had the Bull Moose Party.
So do I.
I just wish we still had the Bull Moose Party.
But it was that third party that gave the election to Woodrow Wilson.
That's right.
Which we'll talk about later on. But.
And then Roosevelt, when World War I breaks out, wants to go to war. And Wilson shuts it down.
Yeah, he wants to go fight in France.
Yes.
And he writes to Wilson and says, I will lead a division.
The experience of... Can you imagine Roosevelt as a commander in World War I? I wish we had that. I would have loved to read the history of Roosevelt.
A two-term president leading the charge. Yeah.
Can you imagine Roosevelt's like a tank commander in France? I mean, that would have been the best thing, right? Trench warfare with Roosevelt. Can you imagine what this would have been like? But it doesn't happen. And I always wonder, because I've read through this a lot, and I've read a lot of different opinions, was Wilson just intimidated by Roosevelt? I think he was afraid that Roosevelt would come back a war hero and Wilson would have no power.
I think you're absolutely right. And, and Wilson wanted to be an isolationist.
Yes, he did.
And then, Roosevelt's sons enlist and fight in World War I.
All of them have military. And even his daughters are nurses. Yes. All of his children have military.
He loses one. Quentin, he loses in an airplane disaster. But, I mean, and then after that, he goes down the Amazon.
Yes.
Uncharted.
Totally uncharted. He's the first white European.
Malaria.
Yes.
Just
basically
near death.
Loses a lung from the malaria. And has seen things that no one else had even seen at the time. And he takes his son Kermit with him.
Yep.
And they're just journaling, and they're seeing stuff they've never even seen before. They're bathing with piranhas, and who does this stuff? But this is Teddy Roosevelt.
This is him, and if he hadn't died at age 60, I think he was getting ready to make another run for president.
I think you're right. I often wonder, and again, I know we're getting ahead of ourselves, but Franklin D. Roosevelt, who's his fourth cousin, something like that.
Eleanor was his niece.
Yes, because of course the Roosevelts are cousins when they marry, so it's one of those good Alabama families.
Yeah, you go.
But when we look at this idea, I think Franklin Roosevelt, the reason why he ran for 4 terms is because he thought he was carrying the legacy of Teddy Roosevelt.
Yeah.
But Franklin was not a Teddy.
No.
You look at Teddy's Square Deal. I don't know if you want to talk on this or not.
Yep.
The Square Deal was not the New Deal.
No.
The New Deal is nothing like the Square
But the
Deal.
Square Deal brought everybody together.
Yes, it did.
It brought labor, it brought management together,
Yes, it did.
it brought conservationists, it brought capitalists together.
Yes.
And he was successful. That's what helped him get reelected. Because here he was a progressive, no doubt about it. He was a conservative progressive if you could ever be one.
Which is a cool thought, a conservative progressive.
Yes.
But yes.
And so then when he runs his second term, he knows he's got to be able to get the conservatives and the Republican Party to support him, and he wins overwhelmingly. And he does that because I think one of his confidence, and two, because he's again a great mediator. He brings people together, and they trust him. And that's
because he has integrity.
Correct.
He's going to uphold what he says no matter what.
But he also says, I'm not going to run again after this. And I think he regretted that for the rest of his life.
I do too. Yeah. I love you talking about his environmental nature. He was actually very good friends. Well, he became friends with John Muir. John Muir, the father of parks. And John Muir actually takes Teddy Roosevelt camping in the California mountains, the Sierra Mountains. And Teddy Roosevelt, as president, is basically, I don't want security. I don't want people around me. It's going to be just me and John Muir, primitive camping for like 3 days in the California mountains. And first of all, can you imagine? I would love to hear the conversation of John Muir, this great Scottish Presbyterian mind who's written so much stuff, John Muir, and then Teddy Roosevelt sitting on the campfire at night. I would have loved to just sit on those conversations and just to hear Muir and Roosevelt discuss, I don't know, maybe the character of God. We know Roosevelt's a believer. Muir's a believer. The beauty of nature. I don't know what all they would have discussed, but I would have loved to just sit in. I wish they would have had like some journal diaries of Muir and Roosevelt sitting around the fire for those 3 days and talking.
Yes.
That must have been amazing. But Roosevelt, when he comes back from that camping trip, he helps start some of the first national parks.
Yes.
And he'll start the first bird sanctuary in Florida, actually, down in the Keys. But he protects, 200 million acres? 200 million acres for his presidency. I always tell my students, can you imagine, had he not done that any private business could have bought the Grand Canyon?
Yeah. He established the Department of Forestry.
Absolutely. Which then later is swallowed by the Department of the Interior, I guess. But up until this point, like, anyone could have bought the Grand Canyon and put a roller coaster through it and charged. I mean, like, there was no protection of these natural resources. And he's the first who said, let's make sure we protect this.
What's also interesting is that his foreign policy still, he helped Panama become free from Colombia, and as a result, we started the Panama Canal.
Yes.
The French had failed at it.
Yes.
But because of his diplomacy, his mediator mind, he was able to convince them, and up until the Carter administration, we pretty much had the carte blanche rule and access of the Panama Canal.
Yes. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. But I think one of the things that made him so unique with negotiating, he was just darn likable.
Yeah.
Here he was. I mean, if you ever watch videos, early recordings of him or the speeches that he would give and stuff, he's always just smiling, and he had this unique ability to have strength and power, but have it clothed with fairness and kindness.
Yes.
If that makes sense. And there's not a lot of people who have that.
And to our listeners, there are so many books about him. Pick up one and read it.
Yes,
If you're going to read about any president, read about this guy. It's just an absolute American hero in so many respects.
We talk about the fact sometimes when you watch action movies, like, that guy's so overdone. Had you done a fictional story on Teddy Roosevelt, the critics have been like, that is so overdone, no person can ever do that. Truth is stranger than fiction. He actually did all this stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Like, this is real. All right, one of his most famous speeches, I have to read this, was The Man in the Coliseum.
Oh, I was hoping you were going to do this.
The Man in the I have to read this section from this. I can't talk about Teddy Roosevelt and not do this. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds. He knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends themselves in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place will never be with those cold, timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.
Mm-hmm. That is
one of my favorites.
Absolutely.
The Man in the Arena.
Yeah.
we need some people in the arena again.
Yeah, we got too many in the grandstands.
And they're critics, right?
They are.
How easy. I'm always amazed, like, every 4 years the Olympics come around, and the Olympics can be on TV somewhere, and you watch, and people are like, that looks so easy. How did they not stick that landing? And you're just sitting there going, you're eating your chicken wings on the couch. And here's this guy or this lady who's doing these amazing deeds. And not only does it happen in athletics, but it happens in politics.
Absolutely.
It happens in business. It happens in higher education. And here is Teddy Roosevelt. And like you said, get out of the stands.
Yeah, nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Get in the arena. His favorite scripture passage, by the way, because he was a man of faith, was James chapter 1, verse 22. Be doers of the word and not hearers only.
That was him.
I like that.
That was him.
I like that.
Yeah.
Basically, start doing and stop talking about it. I don't feel like I know we went even long. I don't feel like we even did remote justice to the life of Teddy Roosevelt, but I guess we have to conclude.
Well, there's so much about him. Again, you could spend, we could teach curriculums on him.
Yes.
That's leadership.
It is.
That's American leadership.
I love that. Like the idea that's a good class for us to teach leadership through the lens of Teddy Roosevelt.
Yes.
We got to do this one.
Have no fear.
All right. Absolutely. So be doers of the word and not hearers only. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.